If you have ever wondered why some companies can scale easily while others can't, today Rich and I talk about control versus commitment. The leadership style that the entrepreneurial leaders have within their organizations can really dictate if the company can scale. Companies of the future must learn how to empower their teams in entrepreneurial ways so that their level of commitment and ownership for the goals of the organization provide them the drive to scale and build their business. The control strategy builds obedient but not committed workforce. The commitment strategy, though, builds loyal, committed, long-term partners in the enterprise. We hope you enjoy the episode.
John, I am really excited to get into this topic. This is a topic that I think not only in the business that I work with in CertaPro with our 375 franchise owners, I've seen major transformation for the owners who have worked on moving from a control orientation to a commitment orientation. It makes a difference of the scalability of the businesses I've seen, the engagement of those that work with those franchise owners that have done that. That's been my experience. I have several notes I'm going to be looking down to make sure I'm going to read a couple of things to you. I'm really excited to get into this with you today.
Yeah, I can't wait, Rich. I know that it's something that's very important to you. When we talked about scaling a company, this topic was very important. And I think we see time and time again producers who become entrepreneurs who then have a hard time scaling their business and growing their teams. And I think this whole component about control and commitment is a big key to it. So I look forward to hearing a little bit more about your perspective on it, my perspective, some best practices, and stuff we can share with our entrepreneurs that are listening. So I guess I'd like to first start off. I know that a lot of the principles you've learned over time, maybe through some mentors, maybe through some publications and like. What has been your biggest source about learning of this topic of command versus control? Or commitment, control versus commitment.
Yeah. Gosh, a podcast that I listened to, I want to say it was as recent as 2018, really shed light for me on how this could work. And it was a podcast by Tony Robbins, and he had a guest named Stanley McChrystal. General Stanley McChrystal was on it. And I won't tell the entire story, but just for context, he talked about how he had been in the military for 20 years, up until the early 2000s. And then they went over to Afghanistan. And before I go there, he talked about how the military has this typical kind of triangle hierarchy. So, the smartest person is on top of that hierarchy. Yep. And the militaries that win are the ones that can communicate as effectively as possible up that to the smartest guy. Smartest guy makes a decision and communicates effectively down, and everybody else executes and kind of does their job. And that's a traditional military as he describes it. Yep. So the game in the military, not that it's a game, but it became, can you have a larger military and can you communicate up and down that chain of command most effectively and quickly? And will people follow the orders that they're ultimately given? And that worked, he said, until the early 2000s. He went over to Afghanistan, and at the time, Al-Qaeda changed how they worked. Apparently, they originally worked on the same traditional model, but he noticed that they started to lose some against some of the battles with Al-Qaeda, and they couldn't understand why. And they actually went to school on why was that happening. And what they found out was Al-Qaeda, the way that they worked and were organized, was not through this pyramid shape where there was one really smart person who issued commands and everybody needed to listen to them and trickle down. That they worked with this cell concept. And Stanley McChrystal ultimately wrote a book named Team of Teams that is a very good book I've since read. And they worked on an information highway and technology and speed of communication. So each of the smaller teams would be able to make their own independent decisions and react to what they saw on the ground and make their own best choices. And then they would pass information along as to how it went and what happened, and then everybody was able to kind of do their own thing. Well, this really connected with me around 2018 or so. It was around when I had shifted responsibilities over to being the VP of Leadership and Development at CertaPro. And it connected in a way that was like, man, the people who are direct reports of mine, I want to make sure I work with them in that way, that they are independent decision makers in their area of responsibility. And I am not going to make the decisions for their area of responsibility. They are. My job is to equip them with information across the organization for them to make really good decisions. And they get to own all the successes. They also own all the failures. And I'm there as a sounding board for them to help them with the decision making, but I'm not ultimately the decision maker. That's worked out really well. And there are problems that are getting solved that I don't even know what the problems are. And I find that people really prefer to be worked with that way. And there was something to a control paradigm that I was able to let go after listening to that podcast and really, truly invest in people owning their own area of responsibility. So that's most recently a shift that I had.
Yeah, it's very interesting, when you think about an entrepreneurial organization and how quickly you can move, when you were talking about the speed to which you can work through when everybody has the information and they can actually make the best decisions and grow and go. When you think about, put it in an army perspective or think about a battle perspective, the team that can move quicker is probably more nimble, more flexible. They can make things happen. They can make decisions on the fly versus this hierarchical organization who's going all the way up and all the way back down that pyramid. And it makes me think about, from Stephen Covey, I know we've talked about this a lot over the years, is the speed of trust.
Yeah.
And when you have an entrepreneurial organization that works more in that cell concept than the pyramid concept, and there's trust around the organization to make decisions, good decisions, bad decisions, it doesn't matter. We make decisions and we go. You develop that speed of trust. And the formula, if you recall from speed of trust, is when trust is very high, your speed is really high, and your cost to execute goes down. So in the example you gave of McChrystal, this Al-Qaeda army didn't necessarily need high cost infrastructure in order for them to have a cell concept and be very effective in the battlefield. So I'm curious, I know we don't want to rehash the whole story, but I'm curious as to how did the US Army change their approach from being more of a pyramid run control organization to a more committed kind of cell concept organization in the midst of battle? How do they do that?
Yeah, the exact how I would not be able to speak to, but I did kind of interrupt a bit of the story to go here, and here's how I applied it.
Yeah.
Ultimately, the U.S. military changed how they worked to do it that way, and then we did it better than what they did, and we ultimately ended up winning. And so they did make that change, and Stanley McChrystal talks about some of the evolution in that after 20 years in one model, making that shift. And he goes around and does keynote speaking. Boy, would he be nice to have on the podcast someday, or maybe somebody who works closely with him. But he goes around. He's been, I think, for 11 years now. He's been working with businesses on this concept, and some of the messages. Boy, if the military can do it, you could certainly do that in your business.
Yeah.
I have a couple of things not straight out of his book, but some things I want to just read to you to kind of lay up a foundation of the difference between control and commitment.
Yeah.
And maybe just an orientation and how you might know that you're doing one versus the other. So I'm going to be looking down. I'm going to take a look at some of my notes here. On a control paradigm, you believe there's one right way to do it. If you're on a commitment paradigm, there are many right ways to do it. On a control paradigm, it's an environment of relatively low trust versus commitment is high trust.
Yep, there it is.
Control paradigm. Management is involved in nearly every decision. On a commitment paradigm, leadership is not involved in every decision. Notice a nuance between management and leadership.
Yeah.
Believing that you manage processes and you lead people. On a control paradigm, the employee motivation is primarily external. I need to please my boss. Is this okay? Is my boss going to like that? Versus on a commitment paradigm, the employee motivation is primarily internal. taking pride in their work, wanting to do their personal best. I've got just a few others. And if we go control and commitment, other words for it might be traditional versus a distributed leadership style.
Yep.
So the distributing who's actually doing the leading and what programs in the company. On a traditional style, the owner makes decisions, gives instructions, is the expert, and delegates tasks.
Mm-hmm.
On a distributed style, the owner establishes a shared vision. They don't make all the decisions. They facilitate information sharing versus giving explicit instructions. They give and receive feedback versus saying, I'm the expert. I don't need any feedback. Let me tell you how to do your job. And then the last one is they delegate responsibilities. Again, notice a nuance between delegating tasks and delegating responsibilities. A task being how to do it, and the responsibility being some of what one of our guests, Brandon Williams from the military, had talked about when he talked about commander's intent.
Yeah.
Delegating a responsibility is, I just need you to get here by this time. How you do it, that's up to you. And I want to work with you on the best way to do it, but you're ultimately responsible for how we get there. Yeah. So that's what I've got as far as a few notes on laying up some of the differences between the two, or how a leader might identify that they're in one camp versus the other.
Yeah, this is great, Rich, and I'd love to dive, even more deep here into, you're an entrepreneur running your organization. How do you know if you're running a control or a committed organization? And it seems to me too, with the whole rise of millennials in the workplace now, that if you don't run an organization in a very committed and entrepreneurial environment, you're going to have a hard time with retention. You're going to have a hard time locating strong talent who want to come work for your company. And I think that's why a lot of organizations are very focused on what their values are, what their culture is, how many warm network referrals are they getting to kind of want to work for their company versus having to put ads in the paper, or not the paper anymore, but ads online to try and find people to come work for them. So if we dive specifically into it, you just gave a bunch of criteria of maybe what would identify a control versus a committed organization. I sometimes wonder, though, if the entrepreneurs have enough self-awareness to know whether or not they may believe that their organization, doesn't have one way of thinking. There's many ways, and that they don't tell their employees what to do every step of the way, but the employees feel a different way. So maybe one thing I'd like to think about in this conversation is, it probably starts with self-awareness as an entrepreneur. Am I running a control organization or a committed organization? What are some key questions you should be asking yourself if you're an entrepreneur to really bring that to light?
Well, ultimately, I think the question needs to be asked is, are you getting the results, not just in terms of key performance indicators, but in terms of employee engagement and retention, as well as performance? When I talk about results, are you getting the results and retention that you want? If the answer is yes, then there may not be anything to change. But if the answer is no, that's where there may be something to change. Do you know, John, take a guess. We'll play a little game. Do you know, if you have just 10 people in your business,
yep,
how many combinations of people could be in a room at one time? So you've got person A who's sitting with person B in a room. That's one combination. Person A, B, and C in a room. That's a second combination. Person A and C without B. If you do that and you have 10 people, how many conversations can be happening in your business? Different combinations of different people in the room. I have the answer. Curious as to your guess.
Well, it would seem to me that it's 10 to the power of 10.
Which is?
What is that? I'm not 100% sure what 10 to the power of 10 is, but it's a lot.
Yeah. It's the answer is 1,013.
Okay.
Different combinations. That's just with 10 people. Now, I know some of the entrepreneurs listening may have far less than 10, and some have far more. But just when you look at 10 people, we're not talking about a 1,000-person organization. We're talking about a 10-person organization. And to have 1,013 different combinations of conversations and people and experience in the room at one time, it requires some sense of organization and requires some sense of getting clarity about how we work around here, including who does what. So people owning their role is really important. You can imagine across all those combinations, needing to have people own their role. As you know, you said it on a conversation that we had the other day, whereas an entrepreneur, you want to develop intrapreneurs.
Yes.
Can you expand on that a little bit?
Well, I think it plays into this whole concept. I mean, when I hear a traditional hierarchy control organization versus one that's more distributed and committed, or if I think back to McChrystal's cell concept of Al-Qaeda as an example, what I think about is your organization and the leadership within your organization all being mini entrepreneurs. And we call those, if you're working within an organization, an intrapreneur. And one of the key shifts that I think employers, entrepreneurs, business leaders need to make as we move forward is every single individual or family is really a business. They have a balance sheet, they have an income statement, they want to grow, they want to create some wealth, they want to be well positioned, take care of their security needs and their desires as a family unit, as a business. Or I even look at each individual person in your company, look at them as an LLC, look at them as a limited liability company running around, right? And I really believe that the organizations that can scale rapidly are ones that will convert their managers into intrapreneurs. They will give them all of the key tools, assets, P&L responsibilities, decision-making capabilities, access to really seeing within the business's KPIs and where they want to go, financial incentives to drive the business forward. If you combine all of those things and turn your managers into entrepreneurs, and then their teams start thinking more entrepreneurially as well, I think you create this more committed organization. And I think that when you think about today's freelance society, everybody wants to be an entrepreneur. Everybody wants to really look at themselves as a business. And so I think that paradigm shift is starting to happen. And I don't think you can scale your business today without having an entrepreneurial minded organization. I'll take a step back to that. And I heard recently too, when you talk about employee engagement, retention, results, and if you have 1,013 potential conversations going on, like you just articulated, what is everybody responsible for? One of the biggest problems I see in organizations I've led, and as they've scaled, it became more and more problematic, is knowing who is responsible for certain actions within the company. And when you had one person that was responsible for way too much and they had a team, even if their team grew, it didn't necessarily mean they were more effective. But if you cascaded the responsibilities down within the team and had your entire team act entrepreneurially, if you will, within those tasks, you were more successful. And I recently heard when you hire somebody, the one thing that you should always try and do is identify 2 to 3 things that they are 100% responsible for and need to become the best in the world at. That could be on a manufacturing line. Their responsibility is to make sure that this widget glues to this widget perfectly. It doesn't matter what that is, but they need to be very, very clear, and the organization needs to be very, very clear on what are the 2 to 3 things that they own, that they are responsible for, that they can be proud of, that can be measured, that they can gain success from. I think it's really important. I think sometimes in organizations, people don't know exactly what they own, exactly what they're responsible for. They don't feel entrepreneurial. They feel like they're just a number in the organization. And therefore, engagement's down, retention's down, culture's down, and you end up in this mode that everybody's looking for the entrepreneur to give the direction on where to go and what to do, and you slow down the organization. Your speed of trust goes way down.
Now, 2 things when you talk about getting clear on who's responsible for what, that I took some notes on what you were saying and took a note on a concept or two, that some of our franchise owners create a responsibility list, and actually it's an Excel document that they would use to assign who's what, and they are able to move kind of the boxes over of who's doing what and see So it's all there and it's all visual. So for the entrepreneurs that are listening, if you don't have a centralized repository for you and your staff on who's actually responsible for what, that may be an option or something for you to consider. Another thing is, a lot of people get hired as a staff member of entrepreneurs under a particular job description. What they end up finding out after a few years and discover is that they're doing something sometimes very different than what was in their job description. Another option that some of our entrepreneurs do is they actually have the staff member write their job description for what they're doing today. And it's interesting that you find, again, 2-3 years down the road, how that may change. If it hasn't been pruned in that period of time, if we come back to kind of performance management oriented stuff, we actually want to prune a job description every year. Because if you're doing an annual performance review with somebody who you employ, what are you bouncing that performance review up against? You're bouncing up against that job description. So all that to come back to control versus commitment. Sometimes you got to let that person move where they're passionate, which may be different than their job description. But you also may want to wrap that into the clarity of who actually owns what now around here.
Yeah, Rich, I'm gonna be a little controversial. Maybe this is a good forum for us to have these types of debates, and we always enjoy a good conversation.
Sure.
When you talk about job descriptions and performance reviews, I start like quivering over here, both as an entrepreneur and as a former executive or employee of my boss in a control environment, saying, "Well, write your job description, Mr. St. Pierre." And every year you need to rewrite it. And by the way, when it's performance review time, I want you to sit down at a computer for 5 hours and tell me how you think you've performed. And I actually think both of those concepts are archaic in their complete entirety. I think that as an entrepreneur, again, if the intrapreneur knows, here are the 2 to 3 things that I own, that I'm responsible for producing for this organization. I got to be the best in the world at in this organization. That's what's important. And I think that all the detail and line and written word document of the job description is a thing that millennials do not connect with. And the new workforce of tomorrow doesn't connect with. And I even think when it comes to performance reviews, if you had 2 to 3 things that you were ultimately responsible for, that you had very clear metrics that could dictate how did you perform on these 2 to 3 things that you own, that you're supposed to be the best in the world at. The review process is, did you pass or did you fail? Are you killing it or are you not? And not this 10-page performance review that both the employees and the employer hate doing. I think both of those components speak to the control and not the committed organizations from what I've seen. And when you tell employees that they don't have to do this large performance review process, or managers that don't have to do this performance review process, but you create a very simple responsibility, accountability, and performance organization, the shoulders go down. They feel more connected to the organization versus in the control environment, they'd walk into their boss after a year's worth of hard work to find out they got a C- and they're not getting a raise next year when they all thought they were working hard. So
by the way,
it'd be interesting to hear your perspective on that, because that's something that I've learned in the past decade that I started shifting.
From the paradigm that you're using of the traditional use of a performance review, I line up 100%. I could not line up more. The traditional performance review is, I am the boss. I know what's right. I will evaluate how you're doing compared to what I expect you to do. So let me ask you this, since we'll do this in kind of a playful manner.
Yeah.
If you were going to do a performance review, John, with an employee of yours, and you wanted to foster the fact that there were many ways to do it, that it's high trust, that you're not going to be involved in every decision, you want their motivation to be internal, you want to have a shared vision with them, not one that you exclusively set. You want to facilitate information sharing, give and receive feedback, and be able to delegate responsibilities. How would you go about a performance review differently?
I think it starts at the beginning.
Tell me more.
So, first off, I want to step before the year even starts, as an example. How are you hiring?
Yeah.
Are you hiring fast and firing slow? I know some people hire really fast and fire fast. They just figure I'm just going to take on anybody and then I'm going to get rid of them. A lot of my success that I found with employees when I think back over the years and years and years were people that were contacting us to work for our organization because they had heard good things through other people and wanted to come work for an entrepreneurial organization. You know, that's a rock star, right? That's what you want. You want those warm network referrals. Running a rigid interview process. Where I've gotten burned in the past is when I skipped out on my process. I didn't do my due diligence on the individual, right? You get burned. I know with the organization, most recently in the past decade, I had a process where I would do the final interviews of every single person in the organization. We had several hundred people in the organization, but I insisted on doing the final interview to challenge that employee, but also connect with that employee and see, do they have the entrepreneurial mindset that it takes to come to this organization? But once you bring them into an entrepreneurial organization, if they're clear on what their 1 to 2 things are, their 1 to 2 responsibilities are, what they own, what they need to be the best in the world at, I would use the same concepts that I'm using from the book, The One Thing. What is the one thing that you are responsible for, Mr. Hoffman, to accomplish this year? I'm not going to necessarily tell you. I want you to come to the table based on all the feedback you've gotten from your peers and say, here's what I want to accomplish this year. I want to grow my division by 10%. I want to do this. I want to do that. That would then also dictate your compensation potential and your bonus potential on how much you're going to drive the organization forward. But then, Rich, as something that I know you do very near and dear, is you have to have ongoing, weekly, bi-weekly, monthly if you don't have enough time, conversations with that intrapreneur on where are you versus the goal you set, Rich, versus your one thing. What is the one thing you need to do this month or this week to accomplish the one thing for the year? And you're measuring it and you're measuring it and you're measuring it and you're measuring it as you go. The review process to wait 12 months later to say, hey, let me tell you how I think you've done the last 12 months doesn't exist anymore. Not in an entrepreneurial organization.
So how would you do it in a way that is partnering and creates more commitment and is not what you're picturing in the past? And if you're struggling to come up with something, that's fine. I have a few thoughts. I don't assume I have the right answer, though.
No, I thought I answered it in certain ways, but I'd love to hear your thoughts, Colin. It may trigger some more ideas. But to me, it's an ongoing review process because the goals are clear.
Sure. So I agree with that. Anytime on an annual performance review, anytime there's a surprise in there, that's the first time that an employee is hearing it, the leader made a mistake. You're not saving up, performance development opportunities for the end of the year. So that would be kind of recommendation number one. It's absolutely on an ongoing basis. I have to disagree with one respect of not having somebody write up how they feel they did. I actually feel that that's absolutely key in developing higher consciousness and independence on the behalf of the learners who we're coaching. Is they have to go first and reflect on their own performance. And we actually want to groom their ability to be able to be introspective, to be able to not have to put the best foot forward first, and be able to say, I did this really well, and be very clear about that, and say, I didn't do this really well, and be very clear about that, and do that in the absence of the coach, in the absence of the leader. That's a way that I think we actually develop commitment and independence on behalf of the learner.
Rich, I mean, I think you and I cannot get a task done without introspectively having a conversation with each other on what's 2 things we should have done better or could have done better, and 2 things we did well.
Almost every podcast.
Yeah, but that's a culture, Rich.
Yeah.
That's a culture that you create. It's not something that you implement at your annual review process. I believe that if we were working together in an organization and I worked for you, I wouldn't have to bring out my Word document and type 3 pages of how I feel, I think you and I could sit down and I would know to come prepared to that meeting, introspectively being able to tell you what are a couple of things I should have done better this year and a couple of things I think I did really, really well. And I think that's the tweak of a committed organization. I think entrepreneurs need to start thinking like, what would I want if I was on the opposite side of this? What's the culture that I want? And I think way too many times, I've seen it way too often, Rich, and I've done it too, by the way. So I'm throwing stones on myself as well, where it's the annual review process and you got 20 people that are working with you. So you spit out this document and expect everybody to do the work so they can bring it into you to make your life easier. So because you have to get something on file in HR. It's a horrible process. And we can get off the performance reviews piece because I don't want to take it. But it's part of what creates a committed organization and a committed culture, and even more so, I'll take it a step further, an entrepreneurial culture, that you have the speed of trust, that you can have the same language within the organization and move faster, more cost effectively, and achieve more.
I totally agree. It's a cultural thing. And not only is that used in terms of the learners providing their first cut for then it being brushed up by the person who's been around the business the longest, but the learner providing their first cut. I totally agree. That happens throughout the entire year. That happens on every project that needs to happen. And if people are doing performance reviews, it's no different on a performance review. So it's not a unique process. I'd agree with that for sure.
Yeah.
One thing you and I have talked about in the past, oh, by the way, if somebody wants to move to that culture, a recommendation would be that we do leadership with people, not to people. If you're going to change and you're going to move to a culture of learner does prep first, if you're going to move from a control paradigm to a commitment paradigm, tell the person you're leading, hey, I think I've had a lot of control. It may have stunted some of your growth and independence and owning your role. I want you to know I'm going to be shifting leadership styles with you. I'm going to be looking for you to do more of the thinking first. And then I'm going to be shoulder to shoulder with you. I'm not abandoning you. This is not abdication. But I want to work better on developing you to get to the work product instead of being so focused on the work product. I feel just organizationally in my leadership style, we need to evolve that. You got to tell your learner you're changing leadership styles or they will make assumptions about why it's being done. And in the void of information, people assume the negative.
Yeah, Rich, I think you just hit on a massive topic that leads to committed organizations. One is clear communication on your coaching style, which is a different podcast conversation altogether, and I won't go there. But one of the biggest triggers for me when I learned and started changing my leadership style, and I feel I started building a more committed organization and a much more pleasant style for me personally as well, was when I learned about the concept of servant leadership.
John Maxwell.
It hit me so hard. It was like an awakening of new style. And I was forced into this. I don't think I ever shared this story with you. Yeah. But the way it happened for me, we had Ruth Lund as one of our guests on this podcast, and she was really key to my learning in this area. But I started working for a very, very large third-party logistics company that did a lot of transportation and warehousing. And I came into that organization as the vice president of operations with about 20 facilities and around 1,500 transportation and warehouse employees in my organization. Rich, I knew nothing about transportation and warehousing, much like I didn't know anything about painting when we started College Pro Painters, right? I couldn't go around the organization and tell people how they should be managing these facilities better. But I was brought into the organization as an entrepreneurial leader. And so when I heard of this concept that was within that organization's core values and was being promoted by Ruth within the organization of servant leadership, I was like, well, I can do that. I can go around to my team of leaders and ask them, how can I help you? What are you doing well? And what can you be doing better? And I took that core principle that really, really worked for me creating engagement and commitment within my team to everything I've done since. Regardless of whether I know the entire topic or not.
Yeah.
I allow others to dictate how I can help them, how I can lead them. So when they're coming in to meet, even though they may have a hunch or know that maybe I've been there before or may know, they know I'm not going to give them the answer. I want to know what they think we should do. And that whole concept of servant leadership changed my leadership style at least a decade ago to the leadership style I have today, and I love it.
That's great. That, it speaks to some of our common language from back in the day on the elements of trust. And the elements of trust being character, competence, and common sense of purpose. And what servant leadership and the way you described it, what it really speaks to is common sense of purpose.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the leader coming in to speak with the, if you want to call it the learner or the employee, and having a one-way agenda of, again, I have the answers. I need to impart wisdom upon you. That's not common sense of purpose. And that breaks trust ultimately, because we don't want the same thing. I'm sitting here, you're telling me what you want. You're not listening to what I want. And again, you go back to the things I read earlier. It's, I need to please you and do what you say, but it's not really common sense of purpose. I just want to keep a job. Some of what that leads to, and you and I have talked about this before, is a difference between an employee mindset and an owner mindset.
Yep.
And an employee mindset is just quite simply stated. The employee mindset is how little can I do and how much can I get paid for it? That's an employee mindset. The owner mindset is about owning your role and following through on responsibilities. And some of that you're talking to, servant leadership, flows into common sense of purpose. That flows into, you could see why some people have an employee mindset. You told me to do ABC. I didn't agree. I'm going to check the box on ABC. Even if I see that I could go to D and E, I'm not going to, because you didn't ask for that. I just want my paycheck, and you told me ABC, so I'm going to do ABC, and I'm done at 4:55 today.
Yep.
Can you expand on, for our listeners, your understanding of servant leadership, and maybe just subdefine that a bit more, maybe not even technically per the book, but in your world, what's your understanding of what servant leadership is? And maybe give an example of where you've used it.
Yeah, I would boil down, Rich, if I had to, 3 components of a leadership style that I believe help build a committed organization. One of them is servant leadership, and I'll get to your question in a second and define it the way that I would. The second one is a concept that we learned that sounds dirty when you say it, but it's so effective, is illusion of input with your team. And the third one is allowing your team to fail, which, why would you allow your team to fail? But I want to talk about all 3 of those because I think they're really, really, really important. Number 1 on servant leadership. To me, at the simplest form, it's you work for them. You work for their company. They're an entrepreneur. They have vision them as a business, as an LLC, and your job is to help them be more effective, more profitable as their own business unit and prosper and grow. And your whole livelihood, your whole reason for being as a servant leader is, Rich, what can I do for you? How can I help you achieve your one thing? Now you need to have clarity on what that one thing is, right? But if you have a leader who knows what their one thing is, and they're committed to their one thing, they should be able to come to the meetings with you, to your point, and they're going to tell you what is the one thing they need to do this week to accomplish the one thing for the month, to accomplish the one thing for the quarter, to accomplish the one thing for the year. They should be able to come and tell you what that is. Now, the second key to this is the illusion of input. Because there are certain leaders that would walk in and they're sitting down with Mr. Hoffman, and Mr. Hoffman says, well, John, I don't know what to do this week for my one thing. And 99% of entrepreneurs go to the control mechanism. Well, Rich, here's what you should do. A, B, C, and D. Go do it. It's very clear. Tell me, come back in next week. Tell me how it did. Well, guess what? Rich comes in the next week. He goes, now what should I do, Mr. St. Pierre? Oh, you should do A, B, C, D. And you get in this cycle. Versus, even if the entrepreneur knows what to do, they don't answer the question. They answer the question with a question. Rich, let's talk about it. Have you brainstormed what are all the potential opportunities of things you could be doing this week to accomplish your one thing for the week? And they get the dry erase board out, or they get the piece of paper out, and you go, what else, Rich? What else, Rich? What else, Rich? And the entrepreneur may know exactly what Rich should be doing, but they get it out of the learner, and they help guide the learner to what that one thing is. And a different name for that, as we learned earlier in our career, was the illusion of input. You give that learner the illusion that they actually came up with it themselves, but you help them get there. They walk out and they own it more because they came up with A, B, C, and D, to your point you just made earlier. And then the third piece is allow them to fail. Way too many times, entrepreneurs see a team member making a decision they don't necessarily agree with, but they cannot bite their tongue. They insist on redirecting the team their way. That didn't work. We can't do this. We have to do it this way. I can't believe you guys are going to go do that. Do it this way. The amount of times that I intentionally knew that's probably not going to work because we did that before and it didn't work, or my expertise told me it wasn't going to work, but I let it happen anyway, was not so that the following week I could say, Rich, I told you so. I knew that wasn't going to work. I just didn't tell you. I wanted to screw with you. It gives the team a sense that you believe in them. Even if you have a mild debate with an employee, well, I think we should do this. What do you think? And they think something different. Go, hey, Rich, you know what? I trust you. If you think that's the right way to do it, let's go ahead and do this. Let's give that a shot. Right? As opposed to go try it and let me know how it works. I'll tell you I told you so next week. Right? I could see Michael Alasso doing a pretty good piece on that.
Yeah.
So for me, the three keys that have really helped me create a committed workforce had been be a servant leader, genuinely serve others to help them grow and prosper and develop and earn more income and everything else. 2 is illusion of input, and really help them come up with the input if they're struggling with it, as opposed to you telling them what it is. And 3 is allow them to fail, even if you don't think their strategy or what they're going to do is going to work. Allow it to happen. Be okay with it. As long as the building's not going to go on fire and you're going to lose your company, those learnings are critical for their development. So hopefully I answered your question, but those are the 3 keys as a leader for myself. I feel like I've been able to help create committed organizations and teams. Do you share any of those 3 or anything additional you would add to that?
Yeah, I really like what you shared, and I took notes on it. The one that I've evolved with is what you're titling illusion of input. And I'm going to bring it full circle back around, very intentionally, I guess, because it's what comes to mind for me, back around to performance reviews. Because I got feedback on a performance review of mine that must have been 5 years ago, on how I was using this illusion of input and how it was working against me to build trust. So there's a way to do it that burns trust that I was doing. The way to do it is kind of going, hey, John, how are we going to tackle this particular obstacle? What are your thoughts? And then you say something, and then I say, well, here's what I think. And I've clearly thought about it more, and I clearly have more experience. And the person is kind of left going, well, why didn't you just tell me that? Why did you make me try to have to guess what you're thinking? You've been doing this for 15 years. I'm like a 2-year-old employee. If you had and that makes them question a bunch. I was doing that, and people were questioning some trust with me on how I was communicating with them. What I was taught in that particular performance review was, if I have a strong opinion, go ahead and put it out there, and then ask for somebody else's input, and that will build more trust. So to be able to say, hey, John, I think we should tackle the hill by going to the right. I think that's the right way to go. What I'm not sure about is if we all go at the same time or if only half of us go at first. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on the whole thing, but definitely that, the half at first or everybody at first. So genuinely, instead of the illusion part, can feel like manipulation to a learner, where it can feel like, can you guess what I'm thinking? And I have found ways where I actually think that's a useful coaching tool to be able to do that, but I introduce it that way because I want to do leadership with people, not to people. So if I want them to guess what I'm thinking, and I think I have a really good answer, sometimes I'll just say, hey, John, pop quiz. Do you remember A, B, and C? I have something in mind that I think leads to D. Pop quiz. I want to see if you could come up with it. So you're letting them know we're playing the guess what the leader is thinking game. The other one would be just saying, hey, I have some thoughts on how we can approach that problem, but I'd love to hear yours first, and then I'm happy to weigh in. So again, those are just a couple of tools that I have evolved from because I've gotten on the wrong side of this illusion of input thing, and it's felt manipulative and eroded a little bit of trust. And thank goodness I had a very skilled coach who knew how to do throughout the year cultural reviews and an annual review, and it really stuck with me in that annual performance review. And man, that's one of my big opportunities for me to shift, and I did, and I have, and it's going much better.
Yeah, I think that's all great points, and I think a lot of this too comes down to intent. If you're trying to fool somebody, if you're genuinely trying to help them and teach them and learn. So I think intent's critically important, but I think everything you shared is spot on.
Yeah. And it's just tactics. Like I don't question your intent when you're talking about illusion of input. I'm only saying tactically, I've done it wrong.
Yep.
And you remember there was a conversation that we had, and it was with Jeff Wall, where we talked about the difference between manipulation and persuasion.
Yeah.
Is that one word that you just mentioned.
That's right.
You may tactically do some of the same things, but the difference between manipulating somebody or persuading somebody or inspiring them is intent. Is your intent in working with them to change their performance in the future, is it serving you almost exclusively as a leader and your organizational needs, or is it also serving them? If it's serving you, it's manipulation. If it's also serving them, it's persuasion or, that type of thing.
Rich, one of the conversations I think we need to have as it relates to control versus committed organizations and how you can shift that. It seems to me, I spent a little bit of time talking in this conversation about how you need to be entrepreneurial and look at all of your employees or entrepreneurs as little business units and how can you help them prosper. There's certainly a big calling right now for people to be their own entrepreneurs, to be freelance workers. And, it's an entrepreneurial society we're moving to. I don't think we can skip this conversation without talking about compensation and equity within organizations. And it seems to me like the organizations of the future are going to be organizations where the entrepreneurs really are entrepreneurs because they have a stake in the business, or they have a control over how their compensation is going to grow. And they're not waiting, to your point, till the end of the year to find out they're getting a 3% raise. There's mechanisms built in place for their compensation to grow. There's a mechanism in place for them to have a piece of the company some way, shape, or form. Do you share that theory? Have you heard more about that, or what's your perspective on compensation and equity as it relates to control versus committed organizations?
For particular owners that have a key staff person in our business, some of them have moved towards the equity route, not a ton of them. Some of them have. But the equity route can get very sticky because then when that employee leaves, the owner actually has to buy them out. So if somebody's going to go the equity route, like it better be, that's like a marriage. Like it better be you're in it for the long term with that person. We've had other owners that instead of going the equity route can have people participate in the whole business's performance by doing profit sharing or doing a VAR. So there are other ways outside of just salary and bonus and commission to be able to have somebody be bought in to the whole performance of the organization. outside of just going from salary and bonus, now I'm going to give them shares of the company. I wouldn't recommend making that jump. Get them in on profit sharing first. If they continue to look to be a long-term person in your business, go the equity route, but consider it a marriage, because sometimes a divorce is on equity can get ugly.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that for a second. I agree wholeheartedly. I think that equity is the one thing that sometimes entrepreneurs give away too quickly, and they can never get back easily. And I do agree with you. I think that there's other mechanisms, whether it be phantom equity. You mentioned VAR, which I believe stands for value appreciation rights. Is that correct? You have profit sharing. There's a whole bunch of other things you can do. I look at all of those, though, as executive or employee equity components, where more so than just their salary or bonus and 401k, there's a mechanism for them to feel a part of the growing organization and feel more committed to the organization. And
I'd
I
say
know
for them to create wealth.
Yeah, absolutely.
You create enough independence with an employee that really owns their role. And they're going to wonder, like, boy, I've developed real independence and I've developed a lot of skill. How can I cash in on that? And, some people are concerned, boy, if I give people that much equity, my hands are tied as the employer to that person because I don't even know everything that they're doing. I'm developing them in that way. And then they're going to leave me. And then I'm kind of screwed. And it's like, there's a point where they're so independent that you may want to consider doing profit sharing so that they can create wealth in the company and not have to leave you in order to do it.
Absolutely. If you care enough about your team as entrepreneurs, as business units themselves, having some sort of mechanism for them to participate is an incredible way to get your team committed. I think way too many entrepreneurs get caught in how should I do it? And you mentioned a really good point about maybe equity is not the right idea. But there are so many other plans, whether it be annual profit sharing, whether it be value appreciation, Class B shares, anything. There are ways to do it. I know for one, Rich, myself, I've committed going forward. I don't want to run an organization where the key leadership of the team don't have a stake in the business some way, shape, or form. It's just too important for them to feel committed as a part of the organization. But I also want to take this to compensation. Because one of the most uncomfortable conversations that entrepreneurs have is year in, year out, sometimes within the year, employees who at the beginning of the year, got a salary or are happy with it, 6 months later feel like it's not enough. Things in their life change. They get a job offer somewhere else for more money. How do you view compensation as a part of this commitment equation? Can you predefine, I guess, as a question? I've done it before with mild successes. I haven't done it other times, and I feel like maybe I should have done something. Are there ways to predefine a compensation route for your team members that they can see what needs to accomplish in order for their compensation to grow within an organization and have visibility, control themselves of their own destiny versus just waiting to see if the boss is going to give them a raise? Any thoughts on that in terms of how you create a committed organization that way?
Two thoughts. One thought is what you're referencing is really the typical banding that an HR piece of a company would do, which says, you're at level 1, here's the compensation range. In order to get to level 2, you need these responsibilities and these skills in order to get to level 3. And that's all kind of predefined within a role. Some of the entrepreneurs I know are listeners, they don't have an HR team, but just the idea of borrowing some of that thinking in terms of banding and looking at a couple of years down the road, pre-thinking responsibilities and skills that need to be developed. That's a first one. Second one, there's a great video by Daniel Pink, and if we can put it in the LinkedIn and the also the Facebook, great video by Daniel Pink that talks about bonuses not actually increasing performance. And I'm not going to review the entire video. But basically what you need to do is pay somebody enough to take the idea of money off the table for them so they're not preoccupied with more money. That doesn't mean everybody needs to make $1 million a year. But there's a certain level that somebody can get to where they can take a vacation at some point? How many per year? And how many times can I order a $50 steak in a week? And different people have different, levels that they want to get to. But generally, the idea is pay them enough to take the worry of money and compensation off the table so they can just do their job. And when that's done, people perform better than when they're chasing a bonus.
Mm-hmm.
And when you set up a bonus and people chase a bonus, you're actually restricting their view of things that they can impact because they're so worried about that bonus. It's a really interesting video. I'd recommend you watching it, and maybe our listeners also. It's just a different spin on compensation and how it's used and misunderstood.
Yeah, no, that's great. I know that in some instances, I've had a lot of success creating a 3-year compensation journey
Mm-hmm.
with an employee. Because I know that as an entrepreneur, the part that bothered me year in and year out was having to have a compensation review, a compensation conversation. Although it felt like, although it was literally 12 months, every 12 months, it felt like it was every 3 months, because it was such an uncomfortable conversation of maybe somebody did deserve a little more money, but they didn't earn it. Or I really liked them and I didn't want to lose them, so I was giving them what they needed. But it felt like a continuous, for the employee and the employer or the manager, it's an uncomfortable situation. And I did an experiment a couple of years ago where I said, listen, I don't want to have this conversation every year with you. Why don't we lay out a 3-year plan that, based on what you do this year, is going to dictate how much you get increased the next year. And then based on that year, and we created a 3-year plan. They had line of sight. I had line of sight. It was not a conversation for 3 years. It was beautiful. I don't know if you've ever had any experience like that.
Come back to the title of this particular podcast. Did you notice anything on how that impacted their commitment, or not really? It's okay if the answer is no. I'm just drawing that back to commitment.
Here's what I'll say. I don't know if I have measurable results as to, oh yeah, they committed a lot better and because of this or that. But I certainly feel like the person in this particular example that I'm thinking about left that meeting saying, thank you. I see how committed you are to me and my future and where we're going. And not, okay, this is what I got for this year, and next year I'm going to have to come in and ask for more kind of situation. There was even though there wasn't a 3-year contract that went along with that discussion, it was more of an understanding and agreement of how their compensation is going to grow. There was a sense that employee felt more committed to by the organization and by myself by laying out a plan like that.
Mm. And did they last the 3 years at least?
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah. So just a different perspective. Because I think, one of the things in general, we haven't really talked about this, Rich, but I think it's a good way to close this segment out. You can't create a committed organization without connection. That's why for me, servant leadership was huge. I became connected with my team because they knew I was there for them. I wanted to help them professionally, personally, doesn't matter. But there's a lot of other ways that I think you can connect with your team to create a more committed organization. And we can ping pong this around a little bit, and I can give one, you can give one, but I think there's a lot of really cool tips. As an example, never go to lunch alone, and don't always go with the same person, right? When you're in a work environment, if you're a leader of the organization, ask somebody, hey, let's go get a sub, and just that 5-minute car ride to the sub place and back, or whatever it may be, getting to know people on a personal level is really, really important. That's an example, right? And do you have examples of that as well, of how you can create connection?
Yeah, you made me think of Randy Soma talked about that on a previous episode on people said they knew the president, Randy Soma, but they really didn't know Randy Soma. There wasn't a connection. You also made me think of Brene Brown in all of her work on vulnerability. And she would say that we are hardwired as a species for connection.
Yep.
We're just hardwired for it. When I think of connection, I think not just us getting to know our people, but allowing ourselves to be seen, and allowing ourselves to be seen for both the things that we're good at and the things we're not so good at. And when we can allow ourselves to be seen, those who work with us allow themselves to be seen. and ultimately have more commitment. But the letting go of control circles right back around to that, because if there's a control paradigm, I need to look perfect. I don't make any mistakes. I'm always strategic. Every decision I make fits into a strategy. Have a question, I'm going to have an answer, and it's going to be quick, and I'm going to make you feel like you just aren't as informed as I am. And I'm certainly not going to allow myself to be seen when I'm uncertain about some stuff. So this fits right in with control versus commitment. You want to start working on having a commitment-based culture. Start allowing yourself to be seen. Start saying things like, I'm sorry. Start saying things like, that was my mistake. Start publicly allowing yourself to fail and trust that you'll be able to pick yourself up in the right way and do the right thing next. And you'll be amazed at the number of people around you who start to be comfortable in their own skin around you because you've been more comfortable with yourself with them.
That's awesome, Rich. Entrepreneurial vulnerability is huge. The ability to be able to do all the things you're talking about as an entrepreneur is difficult. It's very difficult because we've talked about this before too, there is a sense that you have to be strong, you have to be perfect, you have to be, but that vulnerability is so strong when it's genuine. And I think the other part that when genuine really can connect with your team is when the going gets tough, they see you in the trenches with them. They see you not just hiding in your office, leaving after everybody's gone, so you don't have to talk to anybody. When the going gets tough, they see your eyeballs to eyeballs, right? They see you rolling up your sleeves and slugging the mud with them, right? To get out of trouble. That builds a tremendous amount of connection, a tremendous amount of loyalty in organizations. I think a lot, we've said for many, many years as part of our learning that relationships are built via conflict over time, or relationships are built with sometimes some conflict over time. Sometimes it doesn't necessarily mean conflict between you and I, just because conflict in the air in general, but we persevere through things together creates an incredible strength of relationship and connection. Well, there's so much there. There's so much to this topic of commitment versus control. But the words we use, the actions we take are so critical to creating that committed organization. And I think control organizations are a thing of the past. It's over.
Speaking of conflict, speaking of equity, speaking of relationship development, maybe on some podcast sometime we can tell some stories about how you and I dissolved a business working relationship together where between the two of us, we had one checking account that all money went into, and how we broke that up and remained being the friends we are and being the professional influences on each other that we've continued to be, and how that's gone down. So that's certainly another podcast and just an option. Thought I'd throw it out while I thought of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that speaks a little bit to the commitment and connection that we have. And Rich, I really appreciate the conversation. This was awesome learning. I think I need to go back and listen to the Stanley McChrystal podcast that you talked about at the beginning. It sounds like a great one.
I'll text it. You'll love it.
Yeah, please do. And if we can help entrepreneurs create more committed organizations, I think they'll benefit from this conversation as well. So thanks a lot.
Appreciate you. Appreciate the conversation. Thank you.